The morning I decided to break every rule I'd ever followed was heavy with August humidity. Fort Bramble's kitchen, my kitchen, though no one called it that, was already broiling at 4:30 a.m. when I pushed through the double doors. The industrial fans hummed their usual dull chorus, stirring hot air around but cooling nothing. Just like my existence here. Constant motion, minimal impact. My name is, Lisa Bennett. Sergeant Lisa Bennett, though you'd never know it from how people address me around here. Most just call me the cook, or hey you, or if I'm particularly lucky, ma'am, without the rank I earned through 13 years of service. I flicked on the overhead lights, illuminating the stainless steel expanse that had been my domain for the past 12 years. The pots hanging above the E. Center Island gleamed dully, as familiar to me as old friends. More familiar than actual friends, if I'm being honest. When you're assigned to kitchen duty after a back injury takes you off combat rotation, your social circle shrinks faster than a wool sweater in hot water. Another day, another mess to feed, I muttered to myself, tying my apron with practiced efficiency. My uniform beneath was perfectly pressed, a habit I couldn't break even though nobody noticed anymore. Nobody except Corporal Mike Davies, who seemed to find my military precision amusing. Today was no ordinary day, though. It was General's Day, the annual celebration when General Keller recognized outstanding service members at Fort Bramble. A day of speeches, awards, and my carefully prepared feast that everyone would praise without once mentioning who had actually cooked it. I checked my watch. 2 hours before my staff would arrive. 2 hours of solitude to start the main event. My grandmother's beef stew, a recipe that had comforted soldiers for over a decade. A recipe that had been revised just last week by Captain Janet Myers, my 32-year-old supervisor, who couldn't tell oregano from basil if her next promotion depended on it. The sound of the walk-in refrigerator door opening broke my reverie. "Didn't expect to see anyone here this early," came a voice from behind me. Captain Myers herself, her blonde hair already pulled into a regulation bun, not a strand out of place. Unlike the casual dismissal I usually received, today her voice carried forced cheerfulness. "I'm always here this early." "On General's Day, ma'am," I replied, keeping my tone neutral despite the anger simmering below the surface. "Been here early every General's Day for 12 years. "Right, of course," she said, barely making eye contact as she skimmed through a clipboard. "Just checking the revised menu. I've made some adjustments to your stew recipe. The General prefers leaner cuts these days." I bit my tongue. The General had personally complimented my stew last year. Not to me, of course, but to Captain Myers, who had accepted the praise with a humble nod as if she'd spent hours perfecting the balance of spices. "The General has never complained about my stew before," I said carefully. "Well, times change, Sergeant. We need to economize and modernize." She tapped the clipboard with her pen. "Oh, and we've finalized the program for today's ceremony. Corporal Davies will be presenting the Logistics Division toast." The pen tap might as well have been a slap. I had trained Davies, showed him every technique he knew, and now he would stand before the entire base representing our division, while I remained in the kitchen, invisible. "I see," was all I said, turning away to hide the flush creeping up my neck. "Will that be all, Captain?" "Actually, no. The acknowledgement board in the hall needs to be updated for the ceremony. I've revised the kitchen staff listing." She placed a printed page on the counter. "Just support team now, more streamlined. Led by me, of course." I glanced down at the page. My name was nowhere to be found. 12 years of service erased with the stroke of a pen. "You've removed my name completely," I said, my voice unnaturally steady. Myers sighed, checking her watch. "Bennett, it's just a formality. Everyone knows you're part of the team." But they didn't. That was the problem. "Of course, ma'am," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. After she left, I stood motionless in the empty kitchen, the weight of all those invisible years pressed down on me like a physical force. I thought of my father's dog tags hanging beside my bed, his voice echoing in my memory. "Wear your stripes with pride, even when no one salutes you." I'd lived by those words, cooked through fevers, missed my son's high school graduation for a last-minute commander's dinner, spent my own money on ingredients the base wouldn't budget for, all to serve, to contribute, to matter. Last year, I'd stood in the back of the hall, watching Myers receive a commendation for transforming morale through culinary excellence. The General had called her the glue of Fort Bramble, while I remained in the shadows, applauding politely. Something broke inside me that day, a slow fracture that had been widening ever since. I walked to the refrigerator and pulled out the ingredients for the stew. The beef, vegetables, herbs, and spices laid out before me like soldiers awaiting orders. My hands, calloused and scarred from years of burns and cuts, hovered over them. Then I made my decision. The beef would remain tough, the vegetables would stay raw, the broth would be water, unseasoned and cold. 12 years of perfection would culminate in this, a meal that tasted exactly like being forgotten. I knew the consequences, understood the risk to my pension, my reputation, what little remained of my career, but some principles are worth standing for, even if you stand alone. My phone buzzed with a text from my son, Alex. "Good luck today, Mom. Wish I could be there to see you shine." I stared at the message, tears pricking my eyes. Alex had always seen me, even when no one else did. He'd grown up watching me pour everything into a job that took and took without giving back. Had that been the example I wanted to set? That dignity was optional? That recognition was something to beg for rather than expect? No, not anymore. I began my preparations with methodical precision, chopping vegetables roughly, leaving them large and unwieldy. I filled massive pots with water, but added no salt, no bay leaves, no pepper. I placed the tough meat directly into the cold liquid without searing it first, without coaxing out the flavors that would transform it. By 6:30 a.m., my staff began trickling in. They moved around me with the comfortable familiarity of people who've shared a workspace for years. I directed them as usual, assigning tasks for the side dishes, the desserts, the bread, everything but the stew. That was mine alone. "The stew doesn't smell like usual, Sarge," Davies commented around 8, his young face scrunched in confusion as he peered into the pot. "Didn't you forget the—" "I've got it handled, Corporal," I cut him off. "Focus on your toast for today." He grinned, straightening his collar. "Captain Myers says it could put me on track for promotion. Said the general always notices who speaks at these events." "I'm sure he does," I replied, my voice deliberately even. As morning stretched toward noon, the kitchen buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major event. Through it all, I maintained my composure, checking every dish except the stew. By 11:30, servers began arranging the dining hall. White tablecloths draped over, long tables. Polished silverware gleamed. Crystal water glasses caught the light from overhead fixtures. Everything was perfect, except for what mattered most. At noon exactly, the base leadership filed in. Officers in dress uniforms, distinguished visitors. General Keller himself, his chest heavy with medals, his smile easy and practiced as he greeted his favorites. I stood behind the serving line, watching as the first bowls of stew were ladled out and placed before the waiting dignitaries. The steam rose promisingly, masking the truth beneath, and then came the first spoonful. The sound of metal hitting ceramic echoed through Fort Bramble's dining hall as the first spoon dropped back into its bowl. Then another, and another. A ripple of confusion spread across the room like a wave, starting at the head table where General Keller sat, his bushy eyebrows drawing together in bewilderment. I stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind my back, watching as Captain Myers took her first bite. Her face transformed from pleasant anticipation to shock, then outrage. Her eyes shot up, scanning the room until they landed on me. The silent accusation in them might have once made me flinch. "Not today." "What is this?" someone muttered, loud enough to be heard across the now quiet hall. General Keller himself raised a spoonful, examining the raw carrot and potato floating in watery broth before setting it down without tasting it. His gaze swept the room, landing on the serving staff, then the kitchen entrance where I stood. Captain Myers was already moving, her chair scraping against the floor as she pushed back from the table. She crossed the distance between us in seconds, her heels clicking against the polished floor like angry punctuation marks. "Sergeant Bennett," she hissed, grabbing my elbow and pulling me back toward the kitchen. "What have you done?" I removed her hand from my arm with deliberate care. "I prepared the meal exactly as instructed, Captain. Economized, modernized." I emphasized the words she'd used earlier that morning, her face flushed crimson. "This is sabotage. This is a message," I finished for her, my voice calm, despite the thunder of my heartbeat in my ears. The kitchen doors swung open behind us as Corporal Davies rushed in, his face pale. "The general wants to know what's happening with the food," he stammered. "Everyone's talking." "Tell him there's been a mistake," Myers cut in. "Tell him we're preparing an alternative immediately." "There's been no mistake," I said, loud enough for both of them to hear clearly. And there is no alternative. A hush fell over the kitchen as other staff members stopped what they were doing, sensing the tension crackling between us. For perhaps the first time since I'd been assigned to Fort Bramble, everyone was looking at me. Really looking at me. "You've lost your mind," Myers whispered, her voice trembling with anger. "This is your career you're throwing away. Over what? A temper tantrum because you weren't mentioned on some stupid acknowledgement board?" The simplistic reduction of 12 years of invisibility to a temper tantrum was the final match to the fuse I'd been watching burn all morning. I unclipped my apron slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the counter. Not my career, Captain, my dignity. Without waiting for her response, I walked past her, past Davies, through the swinging doors and into the dining hall. The buzz of confused conversation died as I emerged. Hundreds of eyes followed my progress as I moved to the front of the room, to the podium, where acknowledgments would later be given, where my name would never be mentioned. I didn't speak immediately. I looked out at the faces, some familiar from years of service, others new recruits who wouldn't recognize me if we passed on base. I saw confusion, irritation, curiosity. Not one face showed recognition of what this moment was costing me. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm Sergeant Lisa Bennett. For those who don't know me, which I suspect is most of you, I've been the head cook at Fort Bramble for 12 years. A murmur rippled through the crowd. General Keller leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "I've prepared every General's Day feast for the past 12 years. I've cooked for your deployment send-offs, your homecomings, your promotions, your retirements. I've been here before sunrise and after sunset. I've cooked through illness, through personal loss, through a back injury that never quite healed right." The room was utterly silent now. "Today's meal isn't a mistake. It's a mirror." I gestured toward the tables. "It tastes exactly like being invisible." Captain Myers had appeared at the side of the room, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. But she didn't approach. Perhaps she recognized that any intervention now would only make her look worse. I've watched year after year as others have been recognized for my work. I've been overlooked, forgotten, erased, most recently from the staff acknowledgement board that no longer bears my name despite 12 years of service. I paused, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. Pride without recognition eventually becomes something bitter. I've given everything to this base, missed my son's graduation, spent my own money on ingredients, worked through fevers, all because I believed in service, in duty, in the idea that what I contributed mattered. My gaze found General Keller, who was watching me with an intensity I'd never experienced from him before. "I didn't want a stage," I continued, my voice softening. "I just wanted a seat at the table." The silence that followed felt endless. I saw uncomfortable shifts, averted gazes, a few nods of understanding from older officers who perhaps recognized something of their own struggles in my words. General Keller stood slowly. The room snapped to attention, a reflex born of years of military discipline. "Sergeant Bennett," he said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "My office, now." He didn't wait for my response, just turned and walked toward the exit. I followed, feeling the stares of hundreds burning into my back. The walk across the base to his office was silent, the August heat pressing down like a physical weight. His office was cool, climate-controlled, with framed medals and commendations covering the walls. Achievements recognized, honored, displayed. The irony wasn't lost on me. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I did. For a long moment, he just looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Perhaps he was. 12 years, he finally said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." "And in those 12 years, have you ever received formal recognition for your service?" "No, sir." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You understand the seriousness of what you've done today?" "Yes, sir." "You've disrupted an official military function, potentially embarrassed superior officers, created a scene that undermines the discipline and order this base depends on." I nodded, accepting each charge, silently. "And yet," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, "you chose today, of all days, to make your statement. Why?" The question caught me off guard. I'd expected immediate dismissal, not curiosity. "Because today is when you recognize those who matter to Fort Bramble," I answered honestly, and I needed to know if I was one of them. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Your service record before kitchen duty. Combat certified? Yes, sir. Logistics officer. 2 tours in Afghanistan before my back injury. He nodded slowly. And the acknowledgement board. Your name was removed? Yes, sir. This morning. By Captain Myers? Yes, sir. He was silent again, studying me with an intensity that made me want to look away. I didn't. What? Would make this right, Sergeant Bennett? He asked finally. What do you want? The question stunned me. No one had asked what I wanted in years. Recognition, I said simply. Not fame, not awards, just acknowledgement that I exist, that what I do matters. Another long silence stretched between us. Outside, I could hear the distant sounds of the base continuing its routines. Vehicles moving, orders being shouted, life going on despite my small rebellion. Report to my office tomorrow morning, 0800 hours, he said finally. Dismissed. I stood, saluted, a gesture that felt both foreign and familiar after so long being treated as civilian staff rather than military, and turned to leave. Sergeant, he called as I reached the door. I turned back. The stew. Your grandmother's recipe? Yes, sir. When properly prepared, is it as good as I remember from last year? A small, sad smile touched my lips. Better, sir. He nodded once. Tomorrow, then. I walked out of his office into the blinding August sun, uncertain if I'd just ended my military career or finally, truly begun it. I barely slept that night. My small base housing unit, usually a sanctuary from the demands of military life, felt like a cell. I paced from living room to kitchen, rehearsing defenses for a court-martial that seemed inevitable. By dawn, I'd drafted and discarded a dozen resignation letters in my mind. My phone had remained stubbornly silent. No calls from Myers, no texts from fellow kitchen staff, not even an official notification of suspension. Just silence. Ironically, the very thing I'd been protesting. I made coffee in the dark, watching the sky lighten from navy to pale blue through my kitchen window. The base was waking up, another day beginning as if yesterday hadn't happened at all. At 7:30 a.m., I put on my uniform for what might be the last time. Every button, every crease, perfect. If today was my last day as Sergeant Lisa Bennett, I would wear the rank with pride until the very end. The walk to General Keller's office felt endless. Faces turned as I passed, conversations halting mid-sentence. News traveled fast on a military base, especially news involving public confrontation. I kept my eyes forward, chin up, shoulders back, the posture of dignity my father had drilled into me since childhood. General Keller's assistant, a sharp-eyed lieutenant who normally barely acknowledged my existence, stood as I approached. Sergeant Bennett, he said, a note of something like respect in his voice. The general is expecting you. Go right in. The office looked different in morning light, less intimidating somehow. General Keller stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the parade grounds. He turned when I entered. Sergeant Bennett, he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Right on time. Yes, sir. I sat, back straight, hands folded in my lap to hide their slight tremor. He took his seat, opening a folder on his desk. My personnel file, I realized with a jolt. 12 years of evaluations, commendations, and reprimands laid bare between us. I've been reviewing your service record, he began, eyes scanning the pages. Exemplary early career. 2 Bronze Stars for logistics operations under fire. Then the injury in 2011, lumbar vertebrae fracture during a transport accident. Medical recommendation for non-combat duty. He looked up, studying me. And then, kitchen assignment. Requested by you? No, sir, I replied. Assigned. I was told it was the only opening that wouldn't require a medical discharge. I see. He frowned, turning another page. And in 12 years, not a single formal recognition, despite consistently exemplary performance evaluations. The last of which was submitted by Captain Myers just 3 months ago, citing your exceptional organizational skills and unwavering commitment to service standards. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Permission to speak freely, sir? I asked. Granted. Those evaluations go into a file that nobody reads. Meanwhile, in real life, I became just the cook, not Sergeant Bennett, not a soldier, just the person who makes the food. He nodded slowly. And yesterday? Yesterday was a breaking point, sir. I took a deep breath. I've accepted being overlooked. What I couldn't accept was being erased entirely. General Keller closed the file, leaning back in his chair. For a long moment, he just looked at me, as if trying to reconcile the soldier in the file with the woman sitting before him. Do you know what I did before I became General, Sergeant Bennett? The question caught me off guard. No, sir. I was in logistics, supply chain management specifically. A small smile touched his lips. Not the glamorous combat role. That makes for good war stories. My job was making sure everyone had what they needed to do their jobs. Sound familiar? I nodded, uncertain where he was going with this. The problem with essential support roles, Sergeant, is that when they're done well, they become invisible. Nobody notices good logistics until it fails. He gestured toward the window. Yesterday you made us notice. My throat tightened. It wasn't the proper way to address the situation, sir. No, he agreed. It wasn't. But it was effective. And sometimes, effectiveness counts for more than propriety. He stood, walking to a cabinet behind his desk. When he turned back, he was holding a small box. The Military Culinary Service Honor Badge, he said, placing it on the desk between us. Rarely awarded. Last recipient was in 2008. It recognizes exceptional contribution to morale and well-being through culinary service. I stared at the box, not daring to touch it. This is not a consolation prize, Sergeant, he continued. This is formal recognition of 12 years of service that should have been acknowledged long before now. I've also authorized a commendation to be added to your permanent record. Thank you. Sir? I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Don't thank me yet, he said, his tone hardening slightly. There are also consequences for yesterday's actions. You'll be formally reprimanded for disrupting an official function. The reprimand will remain in your file for 6 months. I nodded, accepting this as fair. More than fair, really. Additionally, he continued, there will be changes to the kitchen command structure. Captain Myers has been reassigned to administrative logistics, effective immediately. Corporal Davies will be transferred to the motor pool for the remainder of his service term, with ethics retraining requirements. I blinked, stunned. Sir? I don't tolerate the erasure of any soldier's contributions, Sergeant. Not from enemies, and certainly not from our own. Chain of command. His voice was steel. The acknowledgement board has been corrected to include all kitchen staff, with appropriate ranks displayed. He opened a drawer and pulled out another document. There's one more thing. A position has opened at the Officer Training Academy, Culinary Director. It comes with a promotion to Staff Sergeant. The Academy Commandant specifically requested you. After hearing about yesterday's incident, he slid the transfer orders across the desk. I stared at them, uncomprehending. They need someone who understands both military protocol and how to feed 300 hungry cadets, he explained. Someone who can teach them that every role in the military deserves respect. Every single one. My fingers touched the paper, tracing my name printed at the top. A new beginning. A fresh start. Recognition. You don't have to accept, General Keller said. You can remain at Fort Bramble if you prefer, but I thought you might appreciate the opportunity. I do, sir. I looked up, meeting his gaze. Thank you. He nodded once, then stood. Our meeting was concluding. I rose as well, preparing to leave with my unexpected gifts, a commendation, a reprimand, and a future I hadn't imagined possible yesterday. There's a proper dinner scheduled for tonight, General Keller said as I reached the door. To replace yesterday's event, I'd like you to attend, as a guest, not staff. I'd be honored, sir. And Sergeant, he called as I stepped into the hallway. Your grandmother's stew, the real version. I expect it on the menu at the academy. That's an order. For the first time in years, I smiled at a superior officer without reservation. Yes, sir. Walking back across the base, I felt different. Lighter, somehow, despite the weight of the transfer orders in my hand. Faces turned as I passed, just as they had earlier. But the looks were different now. News traveled fast on a military base, especially news involving justice served. That evening, I entered the dining hall not through the kitchen's back entrance, but through the main doors. I wore my dress uniform, the Military Culinary Service Honor Badge newly pinned beside my combat decorations. Captain Myers was nowhere to be seen, but Corporal Davies stood awkwardly by the serving line, his face flushed with what might have been shame when he caught my eye. I took my assigned seat near the general's table. The stew served that night wasn't my grandmother's recipe. It couldn't be, prepared on such short notice. But it was hot, seasoned, and prepared with care by the kitchen staff who had worked under my direction for years. When General Keller stood to make his address, a hush fell over the room. "Yesterday," he began, "we were reminded of an essential truth about military service, a truth I myself had forgotten." He paused, his gaze finding me in the crowd. True leadership doesn't just exist on the battlefield or in strategy rooms. It lives in those who serve quietly, relentlessly, without applause, who carry on despite being overlooked, because the mission matters more than recognition. He raised his glass. To Sergeant Lisa Bennett, whose 12 years of unseen valor will be forgotten no longer. This base owes you more than a thank you. We owe you respect. The room rose as one, glasses lifted in my direction. Faces that had never truly seen me before now looked directly at me, acknowledging not just my presence but my worth. The worth I had always known was there, waiting to be recognized. In that moment, I understood that visibility wasn't just about being seen. It was about being valued. 3 weeks later, I stood in the kitchen of the Officer Training Academy, surveying my new domain. Unlike Fort Bramble's utilitarian space, this kitchen gleamed with newer equipment, better ventilation, and windows that actually opened to let in fresh air. The budget allocation reflected the Academy's prestige. Officer candidates ate well, apparently. "Sergeant Bennett?" A young private appeared at my elbow looking nervous. "The first-year cadets are assembled in the dining hall for your introduction as requested." "Thank you, Private," I replied, straightening my uniform. Another change from Fort Bramble. Here, my rank was always acknowledged. The Academy Commandant, Colonel James Marshall, had welcomed me personally on arrival, showing me to quarters that were a significant upgrade from my previous housing. "We've heard about you, Sergeant Bennett," he'd said, his handshake firm. "Specifically, we've heard that you understand something fundamental about military service that many of our cadets still need to learn." Now, walking into the Academy dining hall, I faced those cadets, 120 fresh faces, men and women who would one day lead soldiers like me. They stood at attention as I entered, a courtesy I was still getting used to receiving. "At ease," I said, moving to the front of the room. "My name is Staff Sergeant Lisa Bennett. I'm your new culinary director." A few exchanged glances, clearly wondering why a mere kitchen supervisor rated a formal introduction. I could read their expressions as, clearly as printed text, "just the cook." "Before you dismiss me as just the cook," I continued, watching several faces flush with embarrassment at having their thoughts so accurately named, "let me tell you what that actually means." I paced slowly before them, making eye contact with as many as possible. "It means I will be responsible for every meal you eat during your training here. For your physical fuel, your emotional comfort, your connection to home when you're exhausted and homesick. I will know your allergies, your dietary restrictions, your cultural food requirements. I will be the person who ensures you have the energy to complete your training." I paused, letting that sink in. In the field, logistics can mean the difference between mission success and failure, between life and death. A soldier who hasn't eaten properly cannot fight effectively, cannot think clearly, cannot lead. The room was utterly silent now, all eyes fixed on me. "You are here to learn how to lead. Part of leadership is understanding that every role in the military deserves respect. The mechanic who maintains your vehicles, the medic who treats your wounds, the communications specialist who keeps you connected, and yes, the cook who feeds you." Colonel Marshall had entered quietly during my speech, standing at the back of the room. He nodded slightly, encouraging me to continue. "3 times a day, you will enter this dining hall. 3 times a day, you will be served by my staff. And 3 times a day, you will have an opportunity to demonstrate what kind of leader you intend to be." I smiled, softening my tone slightly. "Tonight's dinner includes my grandmother's beef stew, a recipe that once sparked a small rebellion at Fort Bramble. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you remember that behind every meal is a team of people deserving of your respect, not because of their rank, but because of their service." As I concluded, Colonel Marshall stepped forward. "Thank you. Sergeant Bennett, cadets, dismissed for dinner service." The young officers in training filed toward the serving line, many casting curious glances my way. I heard whispered fragments of rebellion and Fort Bramble as they passed. My reputation had preceded me, it seemed. Colonel Marshall approached, a slight smile on his weathered face. Well said, Sergeant, though I noticed you left out the part where you served raw stew to a general. Some lessons are better learned through stories than experience, sir, I replied. He laughed, a genuine sound that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. Indeed. Well, I look forward to trying this famous stew myself. Later that evening, after the last dishes had been cleared and my new kitchen staff dismissed, I sat alone in my office reviewing inventory sheets. The Academy's budget was generous compared to Fort Bramble's perpetual shortages, but habits of thrift died hard. A knock at the door interrupted my calculations. Enter, I called, expecting one of the kitchen staff with a question about tomorrow's breakfast preparation. Instead, a cadet stood in the doorway, female, early 20s, with the determined expression of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say. Cadet Rodriguez, ma'am. She introduced herself with a crisp salute. Permission to speak with you? Granted, I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. What can I help you with, Cadet? She sat, back ramrod straight. The stew tonight, ma'am. It tasted like... She paused, searching for words. Like home? I suggested. Yes, ma'am. Her posture relaxed slightly. My abuela makes something similar. Not exactly the same, but it reminded me of her kitchen. I nodded, understanding completely. Food connects us to memories, to people we love. That's part of why it matters so much, especially in military service when we're far from home. Yes, ma'am. She hesitated, then continued. Some of the others were talking about what happened at Fort Bramble, about what you did. Of course they were. Military gossip traveled faster than official orders. And what did they say, Cadet Rodriguez? That you stood up to a general. That you made a point about recognition. I considered my response carefully. This was a teaching moment, one that could shape a future officer's understanding of leadership. I made a point about value, I corrected gently. About the importance of acknowledging the contributions of every person under your command, regardless of their role. As an officer, you'll be responsible not just for mission success, but for the morale and well-being of those you lead. Her dark eyes were intent, absorbing every word. The mistake my previous commanders made wasn't forgetting to hand out awards. I continued. It was forgetting that leadership requires seeing people, truly seeing them, for what they contribute. She nodded slowly. I understand, ma'am. Do you? I asked, leaning forward slightly. Because one day you'll command soldiers who cook meals, repair equipment, process paperwork. Their work won't make headlines or earn medals. But without them, nothing else functions. Remember that. Cadet. I will, Sergeant Bennett. She stood, saluting again. Thank you for the stew. And the lesson. After she left, I sat for a long time, thinking about the distance I'd traveled. Not just the physical miles from Fort Bramble to the Academy, but the journey from invisibility to influence. From being overlooked to being sought out for guidance. My phone buzzed with a text from Alex. How's the new job, Mom? Cadets treating you with proper respect? I smiled, typing back. So far, so good. They're learning, and so am I. That night, falling asleep in quarters that acknowledged my rank and service, I dreamed not of raw stew or public confrontations, but of my father. He stood in our old kitchen, dog tags gleaming against his uniform, watching as I stirred a pot of my grandmother's stew. Wear your stripes with pride, he said, just as he had in life. But this time, he added something new. And make sure others wear theirs with respect. In my dream, I nodded, understanding at last what he'd been trying to teach me all along. Dignity wasn't just something you claimed for yourself. Sometimes it was something you had to demand from others. Not through anger or rebellion, but through the quiet insistence that your value be recognized. I woke with the sun, ready for my first full day as the woman everyone could finally see. 6 months passed at the Officer Training Academy, with a rhythm I'd almost forgotten could exist in military life. My days had structure without monotony, purpose without invisibility. I supervised a kitchen staff who addressed me by rank, managed a budget that respected the importance of proper nutrition, and taught occasional seminars on logistics and resource management to wide-eyed cadets. Most satisfying of all was the steady stream of young officers-to-be who found their way to my office with questions that had nothing to do with food. They came seeking advice on leadership challenges, conflict resolution, and the subtle art of earning respect rather than demanding it. Word had spread about the cook who had stood up to a general and lived to tell the tale. The Fort Bramble incident, they called it in hushed, reverent tones, as if I'd stormed a battlefield rather than simply refused to season a stew. On a crisp autumn afternoon, I was reviewing supply orders when my office phone rang. "Sergeant Bennett speaking?" I answered, still scanning the columns of numbers before me. "Lisa, it's Janet Myers." The voice froze me in place. 6 months without a word, and now here she was, reaching across the distance I'd put between us. "Captain Myers," I acknowledged, keeping my tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" A pause, then, "It's Lieutenant Myers now, actually." The demotion was unexpected. Reassignment to administrative logistics, yes, but a reduction in rank? General Keller had been more serious about consequences than I'd realized. "I see," I said, unsure what else to offer. "I'm calling because—" She hesitated, something I'd never heard from the always confident Janet Myers. "I owe you an apology." Whatever I'd been expecting, it wasn't this. "Go on," I prompted, setting down my pen to give her my full attention. "What I did to you at Fort Bramble, removing your name, taking credit for your work, treating you as less than your rank, it was wrong. All of it." The word seemed to pain her physically. "I've had 6 months of ethics retraining to reflect on it." "Ethics retraining?" I echoed. "Part of my readjustment period." A bitter laugh escaped her. 3 hours every week discussing the importance of proper attribution and respectful command structures. With Corporal Davies, I might add. The image of the two of them sitting through ethics seminars together almost made me smile. Almost. "I appreciate the apology, Lieutenant," I said carefully. "But I'm curious why now, after 6 months?" Another pause. "Because I've been reassigned. Starting next week, I'll be working at the Pentagon Civilian Liaison Office." Of course. Her career path was recovering already. Landing a Pentagon position after such a demotion was no small feat. Janet Myers would always find a way to rise. "Congratulations," I said, meaning it despite everything. "Before I left, I wanted to clear the air, and to tell you something you should know." Her voice softened slightly. "The raw stew incident? It's become something of a teaching moment at Fort Bramble. General Keller references it in his leadership seminars. This was news to me." "He does?" "Yes. He calls it the Bennett Principle. The idea that recognition isn't a luxury, it's a necessity for effective command. That seeing people's contributions is as important as the contributions themselves." A warm feeling spread through my chest. Unexpected, and not entirely unwelcome. My small rebellion had become a principle, a lesson, a legacy of sorts. "I didn't know," I admitted. "Well, now you do." Her tone turned brisk again, more like the Janet Myers I remembered. "Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Good luck with your cadets, Sergeant." "Good luck at the Pentagon, Lieutenant," I replied. "I hope you remember the Bennett Principle when you get there." After hanging up, I sat in silence, processing the conversation. Janet's apology felt genuine, if pragmatically timed. But the revelation about General Keller using my story as a teaching tool, that was something else entirely. Something that felt like vindication. Later that day, I received an email from General Keller himself, confirming what Janet had told me. The subject. Line read simply, "The Bennett Principle. Sergeant Bennett, you may have heard that your actions at Fort Bramble last summer have become something of a cautionary tale and teaching opportunity for our officer corps. Good. Some lessons need to be learned the hard way by those in command. The commendation in your file has been upgraded to a permanent distinction. The reprimand has been expunged. Your grandmother's stew recipe has been officially added to the Fort Bramble ceremonial menu, with proper attribution. Keep teaching those cadets what real leadership looks like. General Thomas Keller." I printed the email and added it to the small collection of mementos on my office wall, next to my son's college graduation photo, my father's posthumous service award, and a simple plaque the kitchen staff at Fort Bramble had sent me after my departure. That last one read simply, "Sergeant Lisa Bennett, the heart of our kitchen." That evening, I called Alex to share the news. "The Bennett Principle, huh?" He laughed, the sound warming me even through the phone. "Does this mean I get to claim some special privileges as the son of a military legend?" "Hardly a legend," I protested, though secretly pleased by his pride. "Just someone who finally stopped accepting invisibility." "You were never invisible to me, Mom," he said, his voice softening. "I always saw exactly who you were." After we hung up, I stood at my window overlooking the academy grounds. Cadets moved purposefully along pathways, heading to evening study sessions or the gym, or perhaps to the dining hall for a late snack. Future leaders, learning lessons about command and responsibility, and now apparently about recognition. My phone buzzed with a message from Colonel Marshall. Supply inspection tomorrow pushed to 1300. Also, next week's leadership seminar. Would you be willing to speak? Topic: the importance of acknowledging contributions at all levels of command. I smiled as I typed my reply. I'd be honored, sir. I have some thoughts on the subject. The next morning, I arrived at the kitchen earlier than usual. I had a special project in mind, a variation on my grandmother's stew that incorporated flavors from different cultural traditions represented among the current cadet class. A culinary lesson in diversity and unity, served in a bowl. As I worked, chopping, searing, seasoning with care, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the raw stew that had changed everything, the risk I'd taken, standing up for my own value when no one else would. My new kitchen staff began arriving, greeting me with respectful good mornings and yes, sergeants, as I directed the day's preparations. Among them was Private First Class Jimenez, a young woman with an intuitive understanding of flavors who reminded me a bit of myself at that age. Private Jimenez, I called, motioning her over. I'd like you to take the lead on this stew today. I'll guide you through my grandmother's technique, but I want you to make it your own. Her eyes widened. Really, Sergeant? But it's your special recipe. And now it will be yours too, I said firmly. That's how traditions continue, by being passed down, recognized, and honored. As we worked side by side, I shared not just ingredients and techniques, but stories. About my grandmother teaching me to cook on Sunday afternoons. About my father's pride in military service. About the lessons I'd learned at Fort Bramble, both the bitter and the sweet. By lunchtime, the stew was perfect. Rich, complex, comforting, with subtle notes from the various cultural influences we'd incorporated. As the cadets filed in for lunch, many stopped to comment on the aroma filling the dining hall. That's not just Sergeant Bennett's famous stew, I heard one explain to a newcomer. That's the stew that started a revolution. I smiled to myself, watching as Private Jimenez proudly ladled portions into waiting bowls. Perhaps a bit dramatic, but not entirely wrong. Small revolutions sometimes start in unlikely places, like kitchens, where the simple act of withholding seasoning can change a culture. Cadet Rodriguez, now in her second year and near the top of her class, caught my eye across the room and offered a crisp salute. I returned it, remembering our first conversation about leadership and visibility. In that moment, surrounded by the fruits of my labor, both culinary and cultural, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years before my stand at Fort Bramble. Contentment. Not just with my role or my rank, but with the knowledge that what I did mattered, that I mattered, and that, after all, had been the point of the raw stew from the beginning. The Academy's winter formal was 6 weeks away, and Colonel Marshall had ambitious plans. Not just another rubber chicken dinner, he insisted during our planning meeting. Something memorable, something that showcases the best of military tradition, while looking toward the future these cadets will shape. I sat across from him in the conference room, surrounded by the event committee, senior instructors from various departments, all offering input on their areas of expertise. Sergeant Bennett, Colonel Marshall turned to me. The meal is central to this experience. What can your team create that embodies both tradition and innovation? The question carried weight beyond menu planning. It was an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of leadership we were trying to instill in these cadets. Thoughtful, inclusive, forward-thinking. A progressive dining experience. Sir, I suggested. Multiple stations representing different theaters of operation where our military serves. Traditional dishes from those regions, prepared with classical techniques but modern presentations. Marshall nodded appreciatively. I like it. Cultural awareness through cuisine. With your permission, I'd like to invite several former kitchen staff members from Fort Bramble to assist, I added. Many have culinary specialties from their own backgrounds that would enhance the authenticity. Approved, Marshall said without hesitation. Budget considerations? We can work within the allocated formal dinner budget, sir. I've developed some relationships with local suppliers who appreciate supporting military functions. After the meeting concluded, I lingered, reviewing my notes. Colonel Marshall approached, coffee mug in hand. The winter formal has always been something of a stiff affair, he confided. Your approach might finally inject some life into it. Thank you, sir. He studied me for a moment. You know, when General Keller recommended you for this position, I was skeptical. Not about your qualifications. Your record speaks for itself, but about whether someone who had, he searched for a diplomatic phrase, challenged authority so directly would be the right fit for shaping future officers. I waited, unsure where this was heading. I was wrong, he continued. These cadets need to learn that effective leadership isn't about blindly following or enforcing hierarchy. It's about recognizing value, wherever it comes from. He smiled slightly. The Bennett Principle, as they're calling it now. Sir, about that, own it, Sergeant. He cut me off gently. Not many enlisted personnel get principles named after them, especially not for serving raw stew to a general. I couldn't help but laugh. When you put it that way, sir, it sounds like I should have been court-martialed. Perhaps, he acknowledged with a wry smile. Instead, you're planning our most important social event of the year. He raised his coffee mug in a mock toast. Life takes interesting turns. Indeed it did. 2 days later, I found myself on the phone with my former kitchen staff at Fort Bramble, extending invitations to participate in the winter formal. Their enthusiasm was overwhelming. You mean we get to cook at the academy? Specialist Garcia's voice rose. With excitement. With all those future officers watching? Not just cooking, I corrected. Creating, teaching, showing these cadets what military culinary excellence really looks like. Over the following weeks, my days blurred into a continuous stream of planning, ordering, testing, and coordination. I worked closely with Private Jimenez, who had shown such promise with my grandmother's stew, developing her leadership skills by putting her in charge of one of the regional stations. I'm nervous, Sergeant, she admitted during a late-night planning session. These are officers in training. What if they don't take me seriously? Then that's their first failure as future leaders, I replied firmly. Your work deserves respect, regardless of your rank. Remember that, and they will too. The night of the formal arrived with the pristine clarity that only deep winter can bring. Stars blazed in the black sky above the academy, and fresh snow crunched underfoot as guests arrived in their dress uniforms and formal attire. The dining hall had been transformed. Gone were the utilitarian tables and chairs, replaced with elegantly draped rounds and ambient lighting. 5 cooking stations encircled the room, each representing a different region where American forces were stationed: Europe, the Pacific, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. At each station stood members of my culinary team, including the Fort Bramble veterans I'd invited. They wore special uniform jackets I'd designed for the occasion, traditional military olive with gold culinary insignia, their names and ranks prominently displayed. Colonel Marshall stopped by the kitchen as final preparations were underway. He surveyed the controlled chaos with appreciation. Impressive operation, Sergeant Bennett, he remarked. General Keller will be arriving shortly. He's eager to see what you've created here. My hands stilled on the garnish I was arranging. General Keller is coming? Of course. Wouldn't miss it. Marshall smiled at my evident surprise. Did I forget to mention that? As guests began filling the hall, I made final rounds to each station, checking presentations, offering last-minute guidance, bolstering confidence. At the European station, Specialist Garcia was preparing perfect little portions of coq au vin. At the Pacific station, a young private from Hawaii was arranging poke, bowls with artistic precision. And at the Middle Eastern station, Private Jimenez was putting the finishing touches on her interpretation of my grandmother's stew, adapted with regional spices and served in small copper vessels. It looks beautiful, I told her, genuine pride warming my voice. I hope it tastes like respect, Sergeant, she replied with a small smile, referencing the story of the raw stew that had become something of a legend. The formal dinner progressed with military precision. Cadets and officers moved from station to station, sampling the offerings, engaging with the culinary staff who proudly explained the significance of each dish and its preparation. I observed from a command position near the kitchen entrance, stepping in only when necessary. Halfway through the evening, I felt a presence beside me. General Keller, resplendent in full dress uniform, stood watching the proceedings with evident approval. Sergeant Bennett, he greeted me, offering a crisp salute that I returned. Quite a production you've orchestrated. Thank you, sir. My team deserves the credit. Your team, he repeated, emphasizing the possessive. Not the kitchen staff or the support personnel. Your team. I nodded, understanding his point. Language matters, sir. Indeed it does. He surveyed the room, where cadets were actively engaging with the enlisted culinary personnel, asking questions, showing genuine interest. You've created something remarkable here. Not just a meal, but a lesson in respect. That was the intention, sir. His gaze settled on the middle, Eastern Station, where Private Jimenez was explaining something to a cluster of attentive cadets. Is that a variation of your grandmother's stew, I see? Yes, sir. Private Jimenez has adapted it with her own cultural influences. Passing the torch, he observed. The true mark of leadership, creating something that outlasts your own tenure. The formal continued late into the evening, transitioning from dining to dancing as the Academy Band took up their instruments. I remained on duty, overseeing the gradual dismantling of stations and the beginning of cleanup operations. Colonel Marshall found me again as the event wound down, accompanied by several visiting dignitaries. Sergeant Bennett, he announced, these gentlemen were just commenting on the extraordinary quality of tonight's culinary experience. I wanted them to meet the architect. I accepted their compliments graciously, redirecting praise to my team whenever possible. One of the visitors, a silver-haired man with the bearing of a lifetime military officer, lingered after the others moved on. That stew, he said thoughtfully, the one at the Middle Eastern Station, remarkable depth of flavor, reminds me of something my grandmother used to make. High praise, sir, I replied. I'll pass that along to Private Jimenez. It's her interpretation of a family recipe. He nodded appreciatively. You know, I run the culinary program at West Point. We've been looking for someone with your perspective to consult on our approach to cadet nutrition and dining experiences. I blinked, caught off guard by what sounded remarkably like a job offer. That's flattering, sir. Not flattery, Sergeant. Recognition. He handed me a business card. Think about it. We could use someone who understands that food is more than sustenance. It's connection, community, culture. Later that night, after the last of the cleanup was complete, and my tired but exhilarated staff had been dismissed with well-deserved praise, I sat alone in my office. The business card from the West Point representative lay on my desk, representing yet another unexpected turn in a journey that had begun with raw stew and righteous anger. My phone buzzed with a text from Alex. How was the big night? I smiled, typing back. Better than I could have imagined. Tell you all about it tomorrow. Before turning out the lights, I glanced at the wall of mementos, my small collection of visible recognition. Soon, I would add a photo from tonight's formal, showing my team in their special uniforms, standing proud at their stations. Not invisible, not forgotten, not anymore. Spring arrived at the academy with a burst of renewal that mirrored my own journey. Cherry blossoms dotted the parade grounds, cadets trained with windows, open to the fresh air, and I found myself at another crossroads. The business card from the West Point representative had sat on my desk for months, occasionally caught in the breeze from my open window, as if gently reminding me of its presence. Colonel Marshall had called me to his office on a particularly beautiful April morning. The walk across the academy grounds, vivid with new growth, gave me time to appreciate how far I'd come since that sweltering August day at Fort Bramble when I'd served raw stew to a general. Sergeant Bennett, Marshall greeted me, rising from behind his desk. Thank you for coming. Please, sit. I took the offered chair, noting the folder open before him. My personnel file, I presumed. I've received an inquiry from West Point, he began, confirming my suspicion. Seems you made quite an impression on Colonel Harrington at our winter formal. He mentioned a consulting position, I acknowledged. I didn't realize he'd take it further. Marshall smiled slightly. It's more than a consulting position now. They're proposing a full transfer, with promotion to Master Sergeant, to oversee their entire culinary program. He leaned back, studying me. It's an exceptional opportunity. I sat quietly, processing this information. West Point, the premier officer training facility in the country. A promotion. Recognition at the highest level. You don't seem as excited as I expected, Marshall observed. I'm honored, I said carefully, but I've only been here a year. There's still work to do. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. The Bennett, principle in action, not abandoning your post until the mission is complete. Something like that, sir. What would make the mission complete for you, Sergeant? He asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. The question gave me pause. What was I trying to accomplish here? Beyond meal planning and kitchen management, beyond even the occasional leadership seminars I now conducted, what was my true purpose? Sustainability, I answered finally. Ensuring that what I've started continues after I'm gone. That the lessons about recognition and respect become part of the culture, not just a cautionary tale about raw stew. Marshall smiled, more broadly this time. I suspected you might say something along those lines, which is why I've drafted this. He pushed a document across the desk. I scanned it quickly, then more carefully as I grasped its significance. It was a proposal for a formal curriculum edition, a required seminar series for all cadets on the importance of recognition across ranks and roles, with specific emphasis on support personnel. The Bennett Seminars, I read aloud, feeling a strange mix of embarrassment and pride. Taught by you, initially, Marshall explained, and then by instructors you've trained, long after you've moved on to West Point or wherever your path leads next. You've given this a lot of thought, sir. Good leaders anticipate, he replied simply. West Point wants an answer within the month. I suggest you use that time to consider what legacy you want to leave here, and how this opportunity might amplify the principles you've fought for. On my way back to the kitchens, I stopped by the dining hall, now empty between meal services. The space held memories of that winter formal, the stations representing global cuisines, the proud kitchen staff in their special uniforms, the engaged cadets learning that respect transcends rank. Private Jimenez, now Specialist Jimenez after her recent promotion, was conducting inventory in the storeroom when I arrived in the kitchen. Sergeant Bennett, she greeted me with a smile. We've got those special spices you ordered for next week's cultural heritage dinner. Excellent. I hesitated, then decided to confide in her. Specialist, I've received a transfer offer. West Point, culinary program director. Her smile faltered briefly, then returned with genuine warmth. That's amazing. Sergeant, they're lucky to get you. I haven't accepted yet, I clarified. There's still much to do here. She set down her clipboard, turning to face me fully. Permission to speak freely, ma'am? Always. You've already done the hardest part, she said earnestly. You've shown us, all of us in the kitchens and even the cadets, what it means to stand up for your own value, to demand recognition, not out of pride, but out of self-respect. I was touched by her assessment. That wasn't a strategic choice, Specialist. It was a breaking point. Maybe, she acknowledged. But what you did afterward, that was leadership. You didn't just claim respect for yourself. You created a system where all of us could be seen. Her words resonated with something Colonel Marshall had said about legacy and amplification. Perhaps the next step in my journey wasn't about staying to finish what I'd started, but about expanding the principle to affect even more future leaders. That evening, I called Alex to discuss the offer. West Point? His voice carried equal parts amazement and pride. Mom, that's incredible. It's a big decision, I said. Another move, another adjustment. Another opportunity to change the culture, he countered. Imagine, the woman who once served raw stew to a general, now shaping how the highest-ranking officers view the contributions of support personnel. When he put it that way, the path forward seemed clearer. The following week, I formally accepted the West Point position, with one condition, that I be allowed to complete the development of the Bennett Seminar's curriculum before departing. Colonel Marshall readily agreed, understanding the importance of proper succession planning, a lesson at the heart of the Bennett principle itself. Word of my upcoming transfer spread quickly throughout the academy. To my surprise, a delegation of cadets, led by now Lieutenant Rodriguez, graduated early due to exceptional performance, requested a meeting. We want to do something to honor your contribution to the academy before you leave, Sergeant, Rodriguez explained, flanked by serious-faced cadets from various classes. That's not necessary, I demurred. I'm just doing my job. With respect, ma'am, that's exactly why it is necessary, one of the younger cadets interjected. The whole point of the Bennett principle is that doing your job well deserves recognition. I couldn't argue with my own principle being used against me. What did you have in mind? They proposed a formal dinner, planned, prepared, and served entirely by cadets, to honor my service before my departure for West Point. The reversal was not lost on me. Those I had served would now serve me. As spring deepened toward summer, I divided my time between regular duties, training my replacement, Specialist Jimenez in a well-deserved promotion, and finalizing the curriculum for the Bennett Seminars. The work was demanding, but deeply satisfying, the culmination of a journey that had begun in frustration and invisibility. General Keller visited the academy during this transition period, ostensibly for a routine inspection, but making time for a private conversation in my office. West Point, he said, nodding approvingly as he examined the mementos on my wall. Your grandmother would be proud. I smiled at the mention of her. She always said good food tells a story. I never imagined mine would involve raw stew and a principal named after me. Life rarely follows the expected path, he observed, especially for those brave enough to create their own. He turned to face me directly. I owe you an apology, Sergeant Bennett. Sir, this was unexpected. For not seeing you, he said simply. For 12 years you served under my command at Fort Bramble. 12 years of exceptional service that I failed to recognize until you forced me to see it. The acknowledgement, coming so long after the fact, might have once seemed too little, too late. Now it felt like the closing of a circle. Thank you, sir, I said. But in a way, your oversight led to something important. If I'd been recognized properly from the beginning, there might never have been a Bennett principal. He laughed, a genuine sound that filled my small office. Finding the silver lining in a superior's failure, that should be added to the curriculum. On my last evening at the academy, I stood in the kitchen that had been my domain for the past year. I ran my hand along the countertops, remembering meals prepared, lessons taught, respect earned. Tomorrow would bring the cadet-prepared dinner in my honor, and then a week of final preparations before my departure for West Point. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet Myers, now working at the Pentagon. Heard about West Point. The Bennett Revolution continues. Congratulations. I smiled at the term revolution. What had started as one sergeant's desperate bid for visibility had indeed become something larger, a fundamental shift in how leadership viewed recognition across ranks. Specialist Jimenez found me there, standing in quiet contemplation. All ready for tomorrow, Sergeant, she reported. The cadets have been practicing all week. I'm sure it will be perfect, I assured her. She hesitated, then spoke again. I wanted to thank you, not just for the promotion or the training, but for showing me what's possible. Before you came, I thought being just kitchen staff meant accepting invisibility. You changed that. You'll change it too, I told her. Every meal you prepare, every staff member you recognize, every cadet you teach about respect. That's how the principle lives on. She nodded, standing a little straighter. I won't let you down, Sergeant. I know you won't, I said, meaning it completely. Now go get some rest. Tomorrow will be a big day. After she left, I remained in the quiet kitchen a while longer. I thought about the journey ahead, the challenges of West Point, the opportunity to influence an even broader circle of future military leaders, the chance to ensure that the Bennett Principle became more than just a momentary correction in military culture. But mostly, I thought about how far I'd come from that hot August morning when I decided that invisibility was no longer acceptable. The raw stew had been an act of desperation, a cry to be seen, after years of being overlooked. What had followed was something I could never have anticipated, a transformation not just in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. I turned out the lights and closed the door on the empty kitchen. Tomorrow would bring recognition, celebration, honor, all the things I'd once been denied. But the true victory had already been won, not in the accolades or the promotions, but in the simple, profound reality that my name, my contribution, would not be forgotten. The Bennett Principle would endure long after the memory of raw stew had faded. The grand dining hall at West Point gleamed with tradition and purpose, its high ceilings and historical architecture a physical embodiment of the institution's storied past. 3 months into my new position as master, sergeant and culinary program director, I still occasionally felt a flutter of disbelief when I walked these hallowed halls. My office, with its view of the Hudson River, contained a growing wall of mementos. The collection that had started at the academy now expanded to include new symbols of this chapter in my journey. Most prominent among them was a framed copy of the first official military guidance document to incorporate the Bennett Principle, published just weeks after my arrival at West Point. The document, titled Recognition Protocols Across Rank Structures, formalized what had begun with a pot of raw stew, the understanding that acknowledging contributions at all levels was not merely a courtesy, but a cornerstone of effective leadership. A knock at my door interrupted my morning review of menu plans. Enter, I called, expecting one of my kitchen staff with a question about the day's preparations. Instead, General Keller stepped into my office, now wearing the additional star he'd received in a recent promotion. He looked remarkably at ease for someone so far from his usual command. General, I greeted him, rising quickly. This is an unexpected honor. At ease? Master Sergeant, he said with a smile, taking in the office with an appreciative glance. West Point suits you. Thank you, sir. What brings you to the academy? Two things, actually. He settled into the chair across from my desk. First, I'm here to observe the implementation of the new recognition protocols. The Joint Chiefs are considering adopting them military-wide. I couldn't hide my surprise. Military-wide, sir? That's significant. Indeed. From raw stew to Joint Chiefs doctrine in less than 2 years. Not bad, Bennett. His eyes twinkled with genuine amusement. Which brings me to my second reason for being here. The story has taken on a life of its own. I've been asked to contribute to a case study on the incident for leadership training. A case study? I echoed, unsure whether to be flattered or mortified that my act of rebellion would be immortalized in training materials. They want your input as well, he continued. The perspective of the person who actually took the stand, rather than just those of us who had to respond to it. I considered this for a moment. I'd be happy to contribute, sir. Though I should clarify that I never intended to start a movement. I just wanted to be seen. The most powerful movements often begin that way, he observed, with one person standing up and saying enough. After the general left, I found myself reflecting on the strange turns my life had taken. From combat logistics officer to kitchen duty after my injury. From invisible cook to symbol of a leadership principle. From Fort Bramble to the academy to West Point. Each step propelled by that one desperate act of defiance, serving raw stew to a general. My phone rang, interrupting my reverie. It was Specialist, now Sergeant Jimenez from the academy. Permission to brag, Master Sergeant, she said without preamble when I answered. I smiled, hearing the excitement in her voice. Permission granted, Sergeant. The Bennett seminars have been officially adopted by 3 other officer training facilities, she reported proudly. Colonel Marshall has been fielding calls all week. That's excellent news, I replied, genuine pleasure warming my voice. How are you finding the instructor role? Challenging, she admitted, but rewarding. The cadets actually listen when I explain why recognition matters across ranks. Your story still has power. It's not just my story anymore, I told her. It's ours now. Every time you teach those seminars, you're adding to it. After we hung up, I checked my calendar for the afternoon. I had a meeting with the West Point Commandant about expanding the cultural heritage aspects of the cadet dining experience, followed by a mentoring session with my kitchen staff. The day would end with dinner. Preparation for a visiting congressional delegation, another opportunity to showcase the importance of culinary excellence in military tradition. My assistant, a sharp young corporal named Matthews, appeared at my door. The new kitchen uniforms have arrived, Master Sergeant, he reported, with the name tags and rank insignia as you specified. Excellent. Let's distribute them at this afternoon's staff meeting. The uniforms had been one of my first initiatives at West Point, ensuring that every member of the culinary team wore not just their name, but their rank prominently displayed. No more invisibility, no more just the cook. Later that afternoon, as my staff filed into the conference room in their new uniforms, I felt a swell of pride. Each face represented part of the legacy I was building, a culture where contribution was recognized regardless of role or rank. Looking sharp, I commented, taking in the sight of them. How do they feel? Visible, ma'am, one of the younger privates replied with a grin. Definitely visible. As we reviewed the evening's preparations for the congressional dinner, I noted with satisfaction how each team member contributed ideas, offered suggestions, took ownership of their responsibilities. This wasn't just a kitchen staff. It was a culinary team, each person secure in their value and role. After dismissing them to their preparations, I took a moment to send a text to Alex, who was now completing his master's degree in education. Remember that raw stew? It's now being studied by the Joint Chiefs. Your mom, the accidental revolutionary. His reply came quickly. Nothing accidental about standing up for your own worth. So proud of you, Mom. Changing the military one meal at a time. That evening, the congressional dinner proceeded flawlessly. The visiting dignitaries praised not just the food, but the obvious professionalism of the kitchen team. Most satisfying of all was hearing the West Point Commandant specifically acknowledge each staff member by name and rank as he thanked them for their contribution. As the event wound down, one of the congresswomen approached me. Master Sergeant Bennett, she greeted me, extending her hand. I've heard about your work implementing the Bennett principle across officer training. Thank you, ma'am, I replied, somewhat surprised by her familiarity with the concept. I serve on the Armed Services Committee, she explained. Your story has come up in discussions about improving recognition and retention across military support roles. She handed me her card. We're conducting hearings next month on military culture and morale. I'd like you to testify about your experience and the changes you've helped implement. I accepted the card, momentarily, speechless. Congressional testimony? The idea that my personal stand for dignity had expanded to this level was almost incomprehensible. I'd be honored, I managed finally. That night, long after the kitchens were cleaned and closed, I sat alone in my office overlooking the darkened grounds of West Point. The lights of passing ships on the Hudson River winked in the distance, their steady progress mirroring my own journey. On my desk lay a small, worn notebook, my grandmother's recipe book, passed down to me when I first joined the military. I opened it to the beef stew recipe, the pages spotted with decades of ingredients lovingly splashed during preparation. My fingers traced her handwriting, faded but still legible. Remember, Lisa, food feeds more than the body. It feeds the soul, the community, the connection between people. Never forget the power of a meal prepared with love and respect. She could never have imagined how literally I would take that lesson, how a meal prepared without love, without respect, would become a catalyst for transformation not just in my life, but in military culture itself. My phone buzzed with a late message from General Keller. Case, study draft completed. They're calling it the Raw Stew Revolution, how one sergeant changed military recognition culture. Too dramatic? I smiled as I typed my reply. Maybe a little dramatic for raw vegetables and unseasoned broth, but then again, revolutions have started with less. 1 week later, I stood in the massive kitchen at West Point, overseeing preparations for a special dinner. The occasion, the first annual Bennett Principal Awards, recognizing exceptional contributions from support personnel across all military branches. The ceremony had been General Keller's idea, quickly embraced by leadership across services. Among the honorees was Janet Myers, now a civilian logistics coordinator at the Pentagon, recognized for implementing tracking systems that ensured proper attribution of team contributions. The irony wasn't lost on either of us, but her work was genuine, a reformation born of hard lessons learned. As I moved through the kitchen, checking preparations and offering guidance, I passed a young private carefully preparing individual portions of beef stew, my grandmother's recipe, now a tradition at military recognition events. The rich aroma filled the air, complex and comforting. Perfect consistency, I commented, watching him work. He straightened, pride evident in his bearing. Thank you, Master Sergeant. I wanted to get it right, considering the history. The history? Of the stew, ma'am. How it started everything, when you served it raw to make a point about recognition. I smiled, touched that the story continued to resonate. The stew was just the messenger. The message was about value, about seeing the worth in every person who contributes, regardless of their role or rank. Later that evening, as I prepared to join the ceremony where support personnel would receive long overdue recognition, I paused at my office window. The setting sun cast golden light across the historic buildings of West Point, institutions that had stood for generations while the culture within them evolved, sometimes slowly, sometimes, as in the case of the Bennett Principle, with unexpected speed. My father's voice seemed to whisper from memory, "Wear your stripes with pride, even when no one salutes you." I had done more than wear them with pride. I had ensured they would be seen, acknowledged, respected, not just my stripes, but those of every service member whose contributions formed the backbone of military effectiveness. The raw stew had been a desperate act, a breaking point reached after years of invisibility. But what followed had been deliberate, purposeful, transformative, a principle, a movement, a revolution in how military leadership viewed the essential contributions of every rank and role. As I pinned the Master Sergeant insignia to my dress uniform and prepared to join the ceremony, I thought about the journey from that hot kitchen at Fort Bramble to this moment. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led to something significant, a legacy that would continue long after my own service concluded. Recognition wasn't just about personal validation, though that mattered. It was about creating systems, where every person's contribution was valued, where no one remained invisible, where dignity was not a privilege but a right. That night, as distinguished guests enjoyed perfectly prepared stew and support personnel received their long overdue acknowledgement, I understood with perfect clarity what my grandmother had meant about the power of a meal. Food could indeed change lives, sometimes by its presence, lovingly prepared and properly seasoned, and sometimes by its absence, raw and unfinished, a mirror reflecting what was missing. In the end, the raw stew had never really been about the stew at all. It had been about standing up and saying, I am here, I matter, see me. And finally, at long last, everyone did.